So let's now dive into the composition API. I already mentioned that we're talking about data, methods, computed, and watch, that we're talking about these four options from the options API, which will now be handled differently in the composition API. These four options are in the end going to be replaced with code we're going to write in the new setup option, a new setup method we can add to our object, our component or view app configuration object. On the other hand, that means that all the other options we also learned about, props, emits, components, those remain untouched by the composition API. So there, nothing changes. What you learned about these options does not change. The only other part which will also change, which is not on this slide, will be the lifecycle methods, but I'll come back to those later. Now let's start with data, and let's see how we replace data with the composition API and this setup method. For this attached, you find a very simple project. It just has one app view file at the moment, which is also very simple. I'm just outputting a username here, which for the moment is hard-coded into my data option. But it's still the data option, so we're not using the composition API yet. Got some styling here, and if you install all the dependencies and then start your development server with npm run serve, you see this here on the screen. Now let's see what the equivalent to this data option would be if we use the composition API. And therefore I'll comment data out, and instead the first thing I'll do is I will add the setup method. This is this new method we can add since Vue version 3 in our component config objects. And again, if we had something like local components registered in the components option, or if we had props here, that would remain untouched. That would stay here. But we now added setup, and now the goal is to replace the data we managed here, so username, with something new so that we still can output it in the template. And there we got two new features offered by Vue that help us with managing data. We need to import them from Vue, so we need to add an import statement to import something from Vue. And the something which we put between the curly braces here is ref. Now this is an import syntax which imports one of many things exported by Vue, and here we're importing ref. Now what's ref? We learned about refs earlier in the course. For the moment, let's ignore that. Ref is slightly related to what we learned about refs in the past, but still, on the other hand, it's something new. So let's ignore what we know about refs thus far. It's a different concept here. Because ref is a function which we now can call inside of setup. And ref creates a so-called reference, but now not just a reference to some DOM element, but instead a value which we can reference, which we can use in our template, for example. So ref creates a value, but not any kind of value, instead a reactive value, where Vue will find out when we change it, where Vue is able to watch it, and where Vue then is able to update the template and the DOM when that value changes and is being used in the template. But ref like this actually does nothing. It creates a value, as I mentioned, so we should store it in some variable or constant. And we are not going to use the this keyword here, because whilst it technically would be available in the setup method, since this is still a method in this object, this here is actually not referring to the Vue config object as it does in methods, for example, because setup is a method executed by Vue very early during the component initialization process, at a point of time where this component hasn't been initialized yet, and therefore this actually won't give us access to all the things we're used to. It doesn't give us access to props if we had any, and so on. So we don't use this here in the setup method, and we're not going to store this value in a property of this overall config object. Instead, we're just going to store it in a plain vanilla variable or constant, and here I'm going for a constant, and I will name it username. So now the ref thing here is stored in this constant. Now I said ref creates a reactive value, but what is the actual value here? We might want to store a number, or in this case a string, our name. Well, you can pass the actual value which you want to store as an argument to this ref function. So here I'll pass Maximilian. And this now creates a reactive string, you could say. Under the hood, it creates an object. This string is stored in that object, and Vue will watch this object so that whenever we assign a new value instead of that original string, Vue will be aware of it and is able to update the DOM. But step by step, at the moment, this code simply won't work. If we try to save this, we get an error that username is created but never used. And it's true, we have that username constant, but we're not doing anything with it. You might think that we're using it here in the template, but actually that's not how it works. It was the case with the Options API that you had access to all your data properties, your computed properties, and your methods in the DOM just like that. This is not the case for some constants you might have in your setup method. If you have a constant here, it's not available in your DOM, in your template. Instead, you need to do one extra step. You need to return what you want to expose to the template of this component this config object belongs to. And you always return an object here. So in setup, you return an object. And into this object, we'll put all the things we want to expose to the template. So here, we want to access a username thing, and therefore in this returned object, we should add a username key. And the value we want to store under that key is the value stored in this constant, which is also named username, but we could have chosen a different name here. And to avoid confusion, let's maybe name this uname, and therefore also name it uname here. So here I'm referring to this constant, here I'm naming this username because I'm accessing username in my template. And what I expose in this returned object is now available in this template. And if I save this now and reload, everything works and we see Maximilian here on our page. So that's how we create and store a value with the composition API. We use this ref method. Now, actually, you wouldn't even need the ref method. If I remove it and I store a normal string here, if I save that, I get an error that I'm importing ref and I'm not using it. So let's comment out the import real quick. But then if I save that, that also works. So why do I need ref then? Well, because I already said that this, if we create it with ref, would be a reactive value. And that's the next thing I want to show you here. Let's say we have a timer here. We use set timeout, which is built into the browser. And after 2 seconds, we execute a function here. And in this function, I want to assign a new value to my uname constant. Now here's how we're not going to do it. We're not going to say uname equal your new value. For one, that's not allowed because this is a constant. Of course, we could turn it into a variable, and now we could assign a new value, but now we would overwrite the old ref with a simple new string. So we would lose the ref. And we want a ref because the ref has some built-in mechanisms to let Vue know about changes to that value. Because if we do it like this, you will notice that if I save this and I reload, after 2 seconds, nothing happens on the screen. We always see Maximilian here, never Max. Now I do assign a new value to uname after 2 seconds, but this new value is never picked up by Vue. The setup method only runs once, so we never return a new object with the new value to the template. And that's exactly why we need a ref. And that's why we can use a const, because I'm never going to assign a new value to uname like this. Instead, we can use uname, which holds this ref, and access a value property. I mentioned that the ref function creates an object, and under the hood, that's an object with a value property. The value you pass to the ref function here is stored under that value property. And you can assign a new value to this value property in this uname object. For example, max. And if you do that, then Vue will pick it up and will update the DOM and the template. You see, this changes to max after 2 seconds. And that's why we use a ref here. It's a reactive value, and we can manage any value here. A string, a number, a boolean, whatever you want. Vue will watch it and will pick up changes to reflect them in the DOM, as it does here. Now, one word about the template here, by the way. You don't access .value here because Vue will automatically drill into that value prop if you expose a ref in your return object in the setup method. So here, username points at a ref, and we need to use the value property if we want to set a new value. But if we pass our ref to the template, Vue will automatically read the value property. So in the template, you don't use .value, but just the ref as a whole, and Vue will do the rest.